Hey, it's Sila Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sila Social Studies. Alright, so today we're going to be finishing up World War I. World War I is over and establishing peace. So at the end of the war, Germans at home and on the battlefield were exhausted of the effects of World War I. Throughout Germany, riots and strikes ravaged the streets, food shortages were suffered across the nation, and there was an overall shortage of soldiers. So German citizens were starving to death with nearly 800 dying per day of malnutrition, and they weren't the only ones to be done with the whole war effort. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire quit the war in October of 1918, and on November 3rd, Austria-Hungary reached a peace agreement with the Allied powers, leaving Germany as the lone central power left in the fight. And seeing that his country was defeated, German leader Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, or November 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered, thus ending the Great War. This day is named Armistice Day, and the repercussions of World War I were felt all over the globe, and the costs of the Great War were millions of lives lost and huge financial burdens. The world was not prepared for a war the size of World War I. So the casualties on both sides were staggering. The Allied powers lost more than 5 million soldiers in total during the war, with the majority of deaths coming from Russia, which was 1.72 million, and France about 1.3 million. American losses totaled nearly 117,000. Since the United States entered the war so late, their losses were small in comparison to the European nations who had been fighting since the beginning. And when comparing wounded soldiers, Russia and France again led the Allied powers with roughly 8 million combined, while wounded Americans amounted to roughly 200,000. The Central Powers suffered heavily as well, accumulating over 3.5 million deaths, and the big two Central Power nations that suffered the most were Germany, gathering over 1.75 million deaths, and Austria-Hungary, which amassed almost 1.5 million. Overall, there were more than 20 million wounded in World War I. Financial losses were staggering throughout World War I as well. Combat battlefields that spread through Europe left farmlands in ruins. Stockpiles of livestock were annihilated as millions of cows and horses and pigs and chickens were ransacked by soldiers and artillery fire. Trenches were dug through fields, bombs were dropped by planes, and heavy artillery fire left huge craters in farmland, not to mention the troops would ravage fields for food. Bombs, fires, and artillery fire also destroyed factories that provided jobs and economic stability for European nations. Forests were destroyed along the Western Front, and millions were left without homes. And in total, World War I resulted in over $100 billion of property damage in Europe, with the majority occurring in France. And large amounts of money were spent to fight this war as well. The United States spent nearly $32 billion, and the Allied powers as a whole spent nearly $145 billion. The Central Powers only spent just about $63 billion fighting World War I. The United States not only spent billions of dollars on the war, but they also lent billions of dollars to Britain and France to support them during the war. And because of this, many European nations were left deeply in debt to the United States. And when it occurred, World War I was the most expensive war ever fought in history. And after World War I, or right towards the end of World War I, a worldwide pandemic of influenza, or the flu, broke out, named the Spanish flu. But there's a consensus that it did not start in Spain. The flu was given the name the Spanish flu because during World War I, Spain was a neutral country and it was not limited on sharing information about deaths from the flu. Nations at war didn't want to do this because they didn't want to give the numbers of dead to their enemy. And in the United States, the flu was first reported at an Army training camp in Kansas. It was extremely contagious and it spread through droplets in the air. It was easily transmissible, which spread across the world in a short period of time, and to make matters worse, there was no cure. Men started dying in droves, and unaware soldiers would be carriers of the virus and spread it to the masses. The flu was spread from soldiers to civilians across the world, with the deadliest spread happening in the trenches. In the trenches, these soldiers were jam-packed together and shared many aspects of daily life, allowing the flu to spread like wildfire. And when men started dying, they were just stacked in death piles. In the United States, life was changed drastically. Like the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, some states forced Americans into quarantine, while other states banned mass public gatherings and schools were canceled. The death rates in cities like Chicago, Illinois, more than doubled during this 2-year disaster. Overall, in the United States, over 800,000 people perished, while worldwide, the death toll is estimated between 50 and 100 million people. So what were the government actions after the war? In January 19, in his address to Congress, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his post-war plan in dealing with Central Powers at the end of the war. And his plan was to deliver just peace with his 14-point plan. Wilson's vision was to take this 14-point plan to the Allied leaders in Europe, and they would give and agree this peace after war. And some key points that Wilson focused on were that there would be an end to secret alliances, which is something that Wilson believed was a major cause of the war. The plan encouraged free shipping and removed all barriers to trade. It would also resolve territorial disputes and settle colonial claims after the imperialization of European nations, and would force these countries to reduce the size of their army and navy. Wilson's plan also was an attempt to spread democracy across the world and supported the right of the people to choose their own government. But Wilson's most prized idea in his 14-point plan was the creation of a League of Nations. And the League of Nations would be an international assembly of nations with the idea that this league would keep peace in the world, and Wilson traveled to Paris to pitch this plan. So President Wilson flew to Paris, France, and met with European leaders to work out a peace agreement. The meeting was called the Paris Peace Conference and was held in the Palace of Versailles and consisted of the leaders of the Allied powers. So leaders at the conference included David George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Georges Clemenceau of France, and President Wilson himself of the United States. There were no representatives of the Central Powers or Russia at the conference because the Allied powers felt that they had no say in what should happen in the post-war world. President Wilson presented his 14 points of the peace plan, and the European leaders strongly disagreed. The issue was that the World War I was fought entirely in Europe. Livelihoods, factories, farms, landscapes, and infrastructure were absolutely pummeled in European countries, while the United States didn't suffer such the fate. Millions of European fathers, sons, uncles, mothers, sisters, and brothers were casualties of war, and mostly only young men who fought in the American armed forces gave their life for this cause. So European nations wanted to severely punish Germany to be sure that they would never become a world power again. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. As part of the conference, Allied leaders introduced the Treaty of Versailles. And as a part of the treaty, Allied leaders made a list of demands to punish Germany. They are right on the screen. That Germany, number 1, would accept complete blame for the war. Number 2, make reparations for war damages. Number 3, give up a large part of its territory. And number 4, greatly reduce its military to a glorified police force. Now, let me explain. It was demanded that Germany would accept complete blame for the Great War. That's the first thing. They were going to say that it was their fault. They would make reparations or payments for war damages. Germany would be forced to pay reparations of $33 billion, which would finally be paid in full to the United States on October 3rd, 2010. Germany was forced to surrender large portions of its territory, and Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia became independent nations. Poland was also restored as an independent nation, which would be important in World War II. And finally, Germany was forced to reduce its military to a glorified police force. The Allied powers did agree to form the League of Nations, which was one of Wilson's 14 points, and the Central Powers broke up and surrendered their colonies to the League of Nations, where Poland was restored as an independent nation. The president was weary of the Treaty of Versailles, but he reluctantly agreed. As Wilson brought the Treaty of Versailles back to the United States to present it to Congress, he was hopeful that they would accept it. Unfortunately for him, they didn't. And Wilson presented the treaty to the Senate, which according to the Constitution needed 2/3 of the Senate to vote to ratify it. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge pushed forth an issue with Article 10 of the treaty because he believed that this article ceded the war powers of the United States government to the Council of the League of Nations. And in the United States, only Congress could declare war, and the treaty would take this power out of Congress's hands. This upset many Republicans, and Senator Lodge believed that only winners should set the terms for a peace and demanded changes to the treaty. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted and the Treaty of Versailles was defeated, falling 7 votes shy of passing. The United States failed to ratify the treaty, and as a result, it did not join the League of Nations. The U.S. would go on and sign treaties with Austria-Hungary, and on August 25, 1921, the United States and Germany signed a separate treaty called the Treaty of Berlin. And this treaty stipulated that the U.S. would enjoy all rights, privileges, indemnities, and reparations for advantages given to it by the Treaty of Versailles.